Dragonbone Archives' new show, Good Scribes Only,
Yes.
where we take a new author who's very excited to be out in the world of writing fantasy and a very old, miserable bastard, and we discuss stuff in fantasy.
Oh, welcome, chat. And today we're going to be talking a lot about cozy fantasy and its impact as a micro genre, where it's from, how we got here. Um, as we've discussed before, my name is Amanda. I have my background is that I have a degree in creative writing. So when approaching this topic, I approached this like I did every topic that I did with autistic enthusiasm in my undergrad. So looking very much forward to discussing in a very much like a diachronic way, like all of the ways that cozy is impacted and how, where I think it started from and where I think it's going. So and then Gray, if you want to introduce yourself.
I am here. Um, I'm GD Penman. I'm an author of more fantasy books than you can shake a stick at, and I'm mostly here to pick apart everything Amanda says and argue with her.
Which is great. Because otherwise, I'm going to think I'm correct all the time, which I already do. So, like, it's probably best that,
It's
somebody
it's
takes
great
me
when you
down a
have
peg.
it's just perfect when there's two people that are absolutely convinced they're correct 100% of the time. It works out well.
Exactly. So, thank you. Welcome, chat. So, I know in chat we did mention, and I just want to say this at the top of everything if you are not caught up on Frieren or Delicious in Dungeon, which are both still premiering, um, leave. Unless you're okay
Yeah.
with being spoiled.
We,
These
we're
shows are
probably
very
not going
good.
to get deeply into the spoilers for both of them, but we will probably, yeah, spoil enough of it that you won't be happy.
Correct, exactly. I see. I end up like with so much of my online media, my algorithmic generated media, right?
Okay.
Which is when I'm on a for you page or in generally that I get spoiled a lot. So I got spoiled
Mhm.
for the scene with Ara in Frieren, the Ara the guillotine.
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I watched that on
Oh,
my for you page before I'd seen a single episode.
I'm very sorry. That's a shame.
It was just as impactful, but I think I would have enjoyed it more
Yeah,
if I had gotten to, you know.
I would
So,
imagine.
but so when I was starting to research for this episode and some of the things that I think about when I think about cozy fantasy, especially, contemporary, I guess, is that like I think it all really starts when it comes to like a visual media with I think our first big move in cozy is Ghibli in the 80s and 90s, especially in what we consider contemporary visual media around anime, things like that. Um,
That's interesting because I would have placed it a lot further back in the sort of pastoral fantasies with Lord Dunsany and all the rest of it.
yeah. Well, okay, so when you say pastoral fantasies, are we talking like books or.
Yes, yes, pre visual media. Well, I mean, there was still art and things, but that was almost bridging the gap between fantasy and fairy tale way
Yeah.
back at the start. So,
No, I
but
definitely
in
agree
terms of
there.
like modern media, definitely Ghibli's a very strong contender.
Yeah. And I think, so the reason I think that is that when we get down to like how we got there, is that cozy fantasy doesn't exist necessarily in like a bubble. I would say it's almost something that is born, like the growth of the genre is born around the times at which it's being kind of fostered, right? So to give like a little bit of context, Ghibli's first film was released in 1986, and that was Castle in the Sky. Hayao Miyazaki grew up in a post-war Japan, and there's very present themes of that in all of his works around the cruel and kind of impersonal nature of war. Um,
Mhm.
and so you have that with the backdrop of beautiful character-driven stories. And I think that that's what really kind of sets the tone for that is when we really get into like what Ghibli did in the 80s and 90s, these stories the Ghibli stories, that is, can be, I would say, higher in stakes than some, right? You still end up with the, like, almost need to save the world when I think of, like, Howl's Moving Castle, right?
Mhm.
Like, there's
It
still a war
definitely gets
on,
into them, but that's not the focus of the story.
right? The focus of the story are the characters. And I think that's kind of what draws us to them is that they acknowledge the things happening around them in the canon, but they also kind of soothe that want for like a simpler life. Like you've seen the meme. I play D&D because I want to have money, travel the world, and hang out with my friends and possibly kiss them sometimes. Like
Yep.
that's yeah.
That's not a meme. That's just D&D.
Yeah, right. And so I think that like that's where a lot of this space comes from. Is that like we think about Ghibli's big break being put after leading on Miyazaki's experience in a post-war Japan, and then we think about how cozy is becoming very popular right now, and the
Mhm.
turmoil we're going to. I think that it says a lot about the world people are living in and what we're seeking to soothe ourselves with.
Absolutely.
So, and I think you can easily draw a line from that to like Frieren Journey's End. Um, and so when we talk about cozy, one of the more like when I think about breaking it apart, right, into what I love, what I don't love,
Mhm.
one of the first things I really love is pacing. Uh, and so when I was kind of looking over my notes, the one thing that I think that most modern television right now suffers from is bad pacing.
Absolutely.
So, and I think it comes a lot from like the Game of Thronesification, and we talk about this a lot. Oh, hello! Thank you for following. Thank you, Iwi Nick. Iwi Nick. All right, you can feel free to correct me. Um, the Lord of the Rings is cozy. Well, they still haven't left the Hobbit, and I,
Absolutely. That's the pastoral fantasy I'm talking about.
that's
That's
exactly it, though, right? And so, what they're fighting for when we get there at the end is for Sam and Frodo to go back to Hobbiton. Yes. Heavy agree. We need more cats in Middle Earth.
I'm pretty sure there were cats in Middle Earth. I just don't think they came up too much in the Lord of the Rings.
Which a shame. A shame.
I like. I'm sure if you dig into the appendices, you're gonna find like cats all over the damn place. So
But yeah, so I guess when we talk about pacing, Gray, and essentially the way that I think this really is born at HBO, what they did with Game of Thrones in the early
Mhm.
seasons, and then you can really see how it kind of falls apart in the later seasons.
Mm.
Is how much of modern TV is just plot, 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 in a way that leaves the viewer kind of breathless.
Absolutely. Well, I think there's. I didn't want to say the gender word, but there has always been a sort of gendering of fantasy as masculine and being plot driven, and character driven stuff being sort of shoved aside into romance. And it's just fascinating to see how many of the people that have been hammered to death with this constant plot drive, find that they actually prefer the character driven stuff because
Right.
ultimately, I mean, characters are the engines on what your plots turn, aren't they? Without a character wanting something, there's no reason for things to happen.
Yeah, to quote my advanced fiction teacher, you have what the character wants and what gets in the way, and that's plot.
Yeah, that's it.
So
And so often we don't know what these characters want. They're just sort of rushing from one scene to the next scene, trying to get to, you know, the next big set piece. And that's something that I think's definitely been a plague on modern fantasy for a long time as well, because of course everyone's trying to replicate that feel like that. You know, when the hair on your arm stands up and you get that feeling of, oh, this is a big epic thing happening, and the pursuit of that means that they kind of leave behind all the little moments that give you enough of a connection to the character to care about these huge events.
yeah, pretty much. Like as much as when we think of '90s anime and the anime of the early 2000s, like I think a lot of people like to rag on filler episodes and things like that. But the thing about filler episodes and your typical beach episode is that they're fun.
Hmm.
So I've been at tables where we don't role play going to do shopping, and like well, sometimes having a shopping episode is a good time. And like you don't want every
Sometimes,
episode to be a shopping episode, but like it adds to your characters to get to see you to get to see them in that sort of lens outside of their usual like I'm here to slay the dragon.
yeah, absolutely. And I think when you talk about transformative fiction as well, I mean, you talk about the coffee shop AU or whatever, it's people taking these characters who they love from these far more dramatic settings and putting them into a low stakes setting just so you can get more time with the characters and actually get to see how they tick.
Yeah, to get to like really and truly see how they drive. Which, by the way, there may or may not be a space where there's a coffee shop AU in the Locktoon books, just so you're aware.
I'm aware. I'm sadly aware. But that
Good.
probably brings us a little bit towards Legends and Lattes, which is a coffee shop AU of a fantasy book that doesn't exist. It's just the coffee shop AU.
Yeah. And I think when we think about pacing, I was looking into the reviews with the Legends and Lattes, and a lot of the people I think who came from a traditional fantasy background, they have a hard time with the pacing of the book. Like, there's a lot of
Mhm.
comments on, like, oh, this felt like the one that stuck out to me said, this feels like a nano project that they had to keep writing after.
Oh,
Which
okay.
I think partially is because we get, like, and this is a spoiler alert, we get this moment where we meet the Madrigal, and it's only
Hmm.
50% of the way through the book.
That's it.
Um,
And I know we're meant to think that the Madrigal is a big deal, but the problem is because we know this is a low stakes book, it's hard to get too overexcited about it because you know the stakes aren't going to be that high. It's not
right.
going to be a fight to the death. It's going to be,
A
well, what
conversation
happened?
in which,
Yeah.
you may or may not need to bribe a mob boss with sticky buns, which, honestly, as far as bribes go, a weekly deliver of those would keep me at bay as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd take that in lieu of protection money. Yeah, I'm sold.
Yeah. Heck yeah. So, and like again, it's the pacing. So like you get that scene 50% of the way through the book, and to go back to kind of what Cats Are Cute 18 was saying, when we think of like Lord of the Rings, it this is kind of a discussion that I had in undergrad because I took a Tolkien class where we talked about the reason thinking through the fact that they didn't cover the return to the Shire.
What's the class called talking about Tolkien?
I wish I will text that professor and tell her to make it that.
Thank you. Yeah, it was interesting. In the films, they didn't show the return to the Shire, whereas in the books, I think it's safe to say the books were a bit more reflective of the war experience that Tolkien had gone through, where you can't go back home again, all this stuff. Where the hobbits are coming back to the Shire, and it's also been ravaged by war.
Right.
But they now have changed and grown enough as characters. They are these epic fantasy characters coming from this cozy fantasy background. They can just walk into the cozy fantasy setting and just steamroll through the problem.
Right. Yeah, Frieren.
Hmm.
Yeah. Which
Fucking Frieren.
are you caught up on that?
I am not all the way to the end of Frieren,
It's still
because
premiering.
yeah, I'm a distance into Frieren, but yeah, it is interesting to see because you have the character who is like grossly overpowered and killed the Demon King and all this stuff, just doddering along doing very low stakes things, and
Right.
that's fun. That's like, what do they do after the adventure's over?
Yeah, and again, the scientific approach that she has to spells is something that I also kind of really enjoy about the show because what she wants is just
I'm here. Don't worry.
okay. Okay. Oh, right, sorry. What she
You
wants
saw nothing.
is I didn't see anything. Correct. That's why I stopped for a second. But what she wants is to simply gather the spells and remember her friends.
Mhm.
Right? And so, like, that's the stake that drives her, and then she gets,
Looped into actual plot that's happening again, which is
yeah,
a problem you find with a lot of anime that starts off small and cozy because like a lot of the resurgence of cozy fantasy and things has definitely come from the light novel side of things, all the Japanese produced stuff. And the big problem I always had with a lot of that was it would start off as cozy fantasy, and then maybe 10 minutes in, after you're having this lovely little, that I'm a witch and I've lived here for 300 years killing one slime a day, and suddenly I'm the most powerful person in the world. That's a fun little concept, but unfortunately they then take it and say, okay, but now you've got to go and be the most powerful person. You can't just continue living your little pastoral life and being happy. And yeah, it's a recurring problem across all the anime versions that they force them to live up to their power.
right. And I think that's something that Frieren does really well, though, is that her abilities or powers, things like that, are always very understated. The show makes a point to explain that, like, oh, this is all just basic magic. In fact, the other magic users are constantly making fun of her. And Fern, they're like, oh, this is such a basic spell. It's such a basic spell, right? Because the point is not for her to be, Marseille, right? It's not meant
Mm.
for flash and bang. The point of the show is to enjoy these moments that are driven not by fights and magic, but by the conversations between the characters.
Absolutely.
And it leaves a lot of space also for like some fun shticks, like Fern being mad at the party in general, right? Fern
Hmm.
being party mom. Fern is party mom, right? And
Absolutely.
and how it works, right? But she's she's the hands down youngest character, and
Hmm.
so
But she's
you
still
get to,
stuck taking care of all these idiots. Yeah.
yeah,
Which, if you've ever played D&D, very familiar experience. That's
yeah, right. And so like we think about it in terms of when we look at other higher fantasy, like you just don't get to enjoy that as much. We think of Game of Thrones, and the characters are never together in a space long enough to develop that dynamic. They've all got the world ending around them that they have to essentially stop. And
constantly.
so, I think that one of the things that I was kind of talking about a little bit when I was thinking about this is that, like, when you end up with such action plot focused fantasy like that, what you run into is that you're spending a lot of time, HBO, uh,
Hmm.
putting in Easter eggs, but not enough time planting tulips. And the problem with that is that come summer, you have a lot of rotten eggs and no flowers.
Hmm.
And so, the show very much needs this sort of media very much needs gardeners, people who are due for slower pacing, who are due for that, to be able to build like shows that you genuinely love, right? Because I can't
Absolutely.
find a single person who enjoyed the end of Game of Thrones yet to. I would love for people to comment on this if they did.
Yes, by all means, if you love the ending of Game of Thrones, please tell us. But you're a liar.
Yeah.
I think the problem was also the books did have a pacing problem in the opposite direction,
Hmm.
where because there were so many storylines going on, it was very slow paced, and you did get that depth with the characters, but it meant that nothing ever really happened. So they were obviously trying to find the balance for the show that was a little bit brighter and more active and all the rest of it. But what confused me is some of the scriptwriters and showrunners have come from other shows that have actually done this well, where they have been planting their tulips the whole way through and it's paid off properly. So um, I know it's quite trendy to hate on anything vaguely related to Joss Whedon, but some of the female showrunners for Angel came across onto Game of Thrones and did a wonderful job while they were still employed and before they got shunted off into the oblivion.
Right. Uh, and sorry, I'm trying to
Hmm.
figure out. The engine's starting slowly today. Um, but pacing is definitely like one of the key parts, and the stakes are the next part, kind of when we start to like pick apart as a skeleton, like what's happening. Um, and so lower stakes adventures is what makes it cozy.
Hmm.
I think we could definitely kind of bridge to, it's one of the things. Go ahead, fight
One
me.
of the things. No, it's interesting to me because we're talking about lower stakes being a key component of cozy fantasy. But if you take it back a little bit further, before you had the tokenization of everything, where everyone's trying to do a huge epic plot, most of the fantasy books were far lower stakes. They were more localized. I mean, Conan was never trying to prevent the end of the world. He was trying to fight some guy who looked at him funny. It was very small scale, but it was still action oriented as opposed
Hmm.
to peace oriented, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
I think it's maybe that the combination of the low stakes and the focus on non-violence almost.
Yeah, the pacificity of it all.
Mm.
I definitely agree with that, and I think that the Delicious in Dungeon is a really good example of that. That the show isn't. It is a little formulaic in a way that
Hmm.
is around the recipe. It's around what they're eating, and when you're thinking about a fantasy dungeon, that's just not a that. It's fresh. It's new.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, Delicious Dungeon is not so fresh and new. It's been on the go for a very long time at this point, but I'm so glad they finally made an anime of it because it was always one of my favorites reading it throughout the years. And it's interesting because there is this epic fantasy plot going on in the background of it, and you do sort of get little bits and pieces of that as the story progresses, but the focus remains quite firmly on the day-to-day life of the people going through a dungeon as a job. Like that's their career. It's not anything to do with it. They're not heroic. They're going and doing things because that's what they get paid to go and do.
That's what the town hired them to do. Yeah.
Yeah, they're freelancers. That's it. They're out there killing monsters because people pay them for it.
When you
And
said that,
I
I'm just like, oh, they have all the benefits of being freelancers too. They work 24/7.
Yeah. But it was just funny too because it did bring me. It obviously brought to mind all the sort of tabletop RPGs and stuff that we play, where a lot of people's favorite times in those aren't the going and fighting the giant monsters. It's the quiet moments where you're all sitting around a tavern, having a chat. It's the contrast.
And I think it speaks to a larger need for authenticity and a larger need for just in general, like developing characters. And I think that's one of the frustrating things about a lot of fantasy is that your main character a lot of the time remains the same throughout the entirety of it. And when we
Absolutely.
don't have that organic growth of character, you get, what's essentially a frustrating viewing experience.
Hmm.
So, I think that when we think about cozy fantasy, it really is like a dive back to character driven plot that's not meant to be a twist reveal every 10 minutes.
Yeah, absolutely. It's it can feel like the pacing is slow because there isn't something huge and dramatic happening constantly. But it's obviously I don't know, it almost takes a higher degree of skill to carry someone through with the story that doesn't have these big jumps and high stakes and all the rest of it because they have to keep on reading because they enjoy what they're reading as opposed to because they've got to find out what happens next. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm very much a perpetrator of this as well. I'm a big fan of the mystery driven storytelling where you throw a load of questions out there for the reader and they have to try and work their way through it to find out the answers to everything. And I think most authors probably do fall into that to some degree or another. But yeah, cozy fantasy, it runs contrary to that. And it's quite fascinating to see.
Especially from like how popular a lot of these shows are. I did not in no places anywhere have I really searched for Frieren, but all of my algorithmic content is serving me Frieren. Like I see it on Pinterest, I see it on Instagram, I see it on TikTok. Um,
I mean, that might just be a personal problem. They might have just looked at you and been like, she needs an elf that gets eaten by fucking mimics every episode.
an autistic elf who gets
An
eaten by
autistic elf.
mimics every episode because
I mean, I'm not saying it, but I'm saying it.
oh, I'm saying it too. You know my opinions on that show,
I know.
specifically around Himmel the hero.
Hmm.
If I've ever seen a more transcoded character, no, it's Himmel. Oh, especially when we get to the sword, the scene, the episode with the sword in the cave. There's no turning it back after that.
No, it's there's a lot you can read into these things because there is time for you to do that. It's not jumping onto the next thing so quickly. You can't actually examine the characters and go, hmm.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess, and this is where I'm going to ask you some questions. Is that like when you think like the visual media that we're at now, and you think
Mhm.
pastoral fantasy, you get your Tolkien. Like what preceded before that?
Oh, fairy tales, definitely. Before you got Tolkien and his pastoral Lord of the Rings fantasy stuff, you had all the fairy tales that then got retold. You got the early fantasy was all quite pastoral, particularly British stuff, which seems to be where it's sort of spawned from. Where you're talking about the old what was the name of the book? But Blood in the Mist and things like that, where it's mostly about a small town that just happens to be next door to Fairy Town,
Mm-hmm.
or it's all very again very low stakes, low scale. What was the book quite recently? Naomi Novik did some fairy tale centered books not so long ago, and that did a great job of raising the stakes from here's a small localized problem to it's actually kind of a problem for the whole country, where it had a cursed forest in it, and the plot revolved around this cursed forest, and your main character is a girl who grew up next to the cursed forest and then she got taken away by the wizard in the tower, and it all feels very like a fairy tale. Oh god, what's T Kingfisher did a ton of amazing fairy tale retelling stuff as well, except it's not retelling, it's actually new fairy tale stories, but again it's always that very focused tight scale
Right. Eh,
with talking hedgehogs and so on.
and sorry, that kind of leads me to my like next point is that like this also leaves space for what the characters that like stick out the most to me in a positive way, which is our silly little guys. Like this
Absolutely.
genre is rife with silly little guys, and
Oh,
it
so
just
many
makes it
silly little guys.
so enjoyable.
Because the focus is on the characters. It's not like if you've got a comedic character in a serious fantasy book, you know they're going to get killed in Act Two to make the main character angry and go after the bad guy.
Yeah,
In this, they just get to go on being silly little guys forever.
yeah, and it's
It's
fun and it's a
beautiful.
good time. You know, like when we talk about Frieren, who gets swallowed by mimics every time she turns around. This is probably the most powerful mage in existence, but she meets a mimic, and let me tell you, that goblin brain switches on. I've got to get the treasure out of that chest, and she gets swallowed up. And it's she's just a silly little guy, you know.
Just a little guy, and it's beautiful. And I do wonder, like we're talking about where cozy fantasy came from. And the obvious route would be saying cozy fantasy comes from cozy mysteries, which was you know your crime genre. It gets very grim and serious, so people started seeking out these stories where it's just some little old lady living in a little village who has to solve a problem, and that's very appealing and it's very pastoral and all the rest of it in the same way that cozy fantasy is. Oh, there's a cat trying to break in. Go away. Um, and that seems like the obvious route, but I actually think it probably owes more to romance than anything else
Yeah.
because the romance genre is where so much of what makes cozy fantasy tick comes from.
Agreed. It's really baked into it. You even mentioned it earlier that, like, when we think of a lot of fantasy, folks get a little, I would say, tripped up and when they encounter their first cozy because of that. It does have that level of just plot driven around the motivations of these characters and what they're doing that is more present in romance than any other genre. Sorry, I'm
Absolutely.
looking for my stream rock, and I don't know where the stream rock is, and I'm a little lost without it. It's my
Your stream
fidget.
rock?
Yeah,
Oh,
I
I
got a
see.
rock that I hold in my hand all stream, and I think the cats might have thrown it somewhere.
Oh dear. Okay,
It's fine. It's
it'll
good.
show up, I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
Exploring for the stream rock. Um, yeah, I think cozy fantasy as a genre definitely owes a lot to romance, and more specifically, it owes a lot to queer creators. Like we talk about T.L. Clune and their fantasy books, which are very much coded as. I mean, you could very much read them as cozy fantasies, or I mean, even again, I keep on going back to fan fiction as the source for this, but fan fiction and all everything that we see in fiction now is being written by people who started off in fan fiction almost exclusively. Like everyone has had access to that. For so many people, it was their first stuff they'd read. Like they saw a TV show they liked, they went off and read fan fiction about it.
Oh
And
yeah.
I think it's definitely been formative, particularly for this genre.
I no, I can speak to that absolutely. My first exposure to fan fiction, I think I was like 10 or 11, and like there was I don't remember. So I didn't actually get my start on FF.net, by the way. There
Hmm.
was a Harry Potter website, right? I can't remember what it was called anymore. It was like Death something or other before I had uncovered fanfiction.net. And amidst all of that, is a lot of stories about that, and essentially learning to play in writing before you look at it from a serious space of like, oh, well, I'm going to write this big novel. Well, let me write this story about a couple of silly little guys in
Yeah,
my favorite show.
and absolutely. And I think you again see that so often. Hello, Fane. Welcome to the chat.
Hello, Payne, and today we're discussing cozy fantasy, contemporary, the history, and just kind of picking at it and picking it apart. And we have a cat on chat, or a cat on
Yes,
stream.
please excuse Frodo. He hates it when I close the door on him, so he has to be here.
Frodo is today's silly little guy.
Frodo is today's silly little guy in the genre of silly little guys.
Yes. Zuko's here. He's just glowering from his perch.
Of course, same as usual. So, where were we before we got distracted by silly little
Oh,
guys?
we were talking about pre-visual media in like the pre-Ghibli era.
Absolutely. I mean, you know me, I read a lot of really old crap. So a lot of the fantasy that I read growing up was the old yellowed paperbacks that you get secondhand that were all Conan and Elric and all these
Mhm.
things, which were these stories with very low. Please, sir. There were all these stories with pretty small stakes, small scales, but still driven by the action. But on the other hand of it, you had stuff like Lord Dunsany, who was trying to tell his own mythology, essentially, which I know is what Tolkien ended up trying to go after. He was trying to make his own little mythology for Britain with the Lord of the Rings and Silmarillion and all the rest of it.
Mhm. Sorry, I have something very painful in my eye, so I'm just trying to
Oh, I'm
get it
sorry.
out.
If it's
I
any
think it's my
consolation, I have a.
contact.
Oh no.
That's fine.
I mean, I have a whole cat in my face, if that helps. Just take a second. There's no panic. Fane, we're talking about the genre in general as opposed to a specific book today. Be- Mostly because we had like a half
BRB.
dozen. Yeah, no worries. Yeah, we were talking about the genre in general, and both Amanda and I have actually written some cozy fantasy, so it kind of gives us an opportunity to blither about that as well, hopefully. In terms of what we've actually covered so far, we've touched on a lot of the anime influences, and I was having a little blither about the pre Lord of the Rings fantasy that was all quite low stakes and more rooted in fairy tales rather than in epic plot lines. But since I'm entirely alone with just me and Frodo here, I'm going to go ahead and say that I think genre in general would benefit greatly if people would just stick to low stakes stories. And I don't mean this in a cruel way, but the voice that a lot of people write with for contemporary fantasy, particularly, is not really going to work well for. Calm down, cat. It's not really going to work well for a bigger, more epic story. It's going to work best for something that's smaller scale. I mean, um, I think everyone's aware of my opinions about Brandon Sanderson, but I have to say the first part of Mistborn, when it was just a small scale story where they were just doing crimes and trying to bring down the bad guy in charge of their city, that was an excellent book. It was only when it tried to expand beyond that limit that I ran into problems with it. Welcome back, Amanda. How's
I'm
your
back.
eyeball?
It hurts. It's fine.
What did you do?
I
Are
took
you
the
okay?
contact out. No, it
Ah,
just
good.
decided that it was mad that I had a contact in. This happens every now and again.
Yeah,
Um,
that's contacts. I think that's why I
yeah,
don't hold with them.
9 days out of 10, I have zero issues, but then there's always one day out of 10 where it's like, well, fuck you.
Fane.
Thank you. I would love to recommend the generator of this blue lip, but unfortunately they're a terrible person, and so I'm gonna have to find a dupe for this. So for anybody watching this, if you have a dupe for this color, which is like a tealy kind of color, this unfortunately is from a makeup purveyor of low human quality. We'll say that. That's how we're gonna say it. You know,
That's
you
one way to
can't.
say
You
it.
you can never be a top tier human when you fake a $22 million break into your own factory.
Hmm.
Sorry, not sorry. It just takes you out of the running entirely.
Well, I'm the same Fane. I'm not really a makeup person myself,
A low
but
energy activity.
it is a good low energy activity. Will you please
Sorry,
settle down?
I come from makeup YouTube, so I um I would not describe it as low energy, but no worries.
So, yes, I blithered a bit about books while you were gone.
I
So
heard.
please.
I had my headphones on the entire time.
Oh no, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. Come on, come on. I know you're jealous. There's another cat on stream. Come on, boy. Get your orange ass on this desk pronto. Let's go.
Oh
Sorry,
dear. Cats.
cats.
Okay, bear with me one moment. I'm just going to pop this gentleman outside because he's becoming more and more interested in the guinea pig, which he's not allowed to be interested in. Off you go, cat.
Oh, well, that's good. That's awesome, though. Like, especially because makeup's a low stakes art, Fane. Fane was just saying that, with chronic pain and other disabilities, makeup was something that their friend was able to do without much, like, a kind of barrier to entry for activity level. And I think that definitely makes a lot of sense.
Absolutely, makes a ton of sense
I wish you could see the
because
construction happening right now.
cat trash
So
the place.
yeah, yeah, so clumsy.
Well, Frodo is down here. I fucking the guinea pig, which is down here. I fucking Frodo. So someday they will go to war, but not today.
Not true.
Right. So, cozy fantasy.
Sorry, I'm letting you carry it for a second because I'm snacking.
You let me. I didn't realize you're snacking. I'm sorry. Okay. We were talking about the pre-visual media stuff, but I would like to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. Is that okay? Because I am a big sucker for all these RPGs, and I think it's very telling that when they come out with a new video game of these RPGs or whatever, what people are interested in isn't how good are the fights or how amazing is the magic. It's which of the characters I can romance and who can we settle down around the campfire with and tell stories with. And these are the things that seem to drive a lot of the people that are buying into these games.
I agree, and I think that All right, this I'm gonna branch out where I think this comes from a little bit,
Hmm.
which is the lack of what we call third spaces, right? So
Hmm.
work, home, and then gathering spaces, right? So, when we think about places that we have to exist, and I know this has always been true for me. When I was post divorce and I had $2 to my name, I spent that last $2, not really, but essentially I spent a couple bucks on a set of dice. I already had
Hmm.
pencil. I already had paper. Right? And that's all it costs to get started playing a TTRPG. Because the majority
Absolutely.
of them are available online as far as their core rules.
Hmm.
And I think what it is that TTRPGs have allowed for the creation of third spaces in such a way that a lot of people who would have never considered trying one out before are now looking at this and saying, well, actually, I can hang out with my friends for 3 to 4 hours and it doesn't cost me $100.
Yeah, which is quite pleasant, really.
Yeah.
Although, of course, you're saying I can hang out with my friends without paying $100. I just bought some source books to run a game for my friends, and it's getting there.
Well, okay, so hold on here. Who did you buy them from? Was it from Watsy or Paizo?
It was from my local game store, who I like to give money to.
Yay!
Source books, indeed.
Yes. I guess what I was saying is which system?
Oh, I have purchased some Dungeons and Dragons books because most of my friends have never actually played Dungeons and Dragons. Would you believe they've played Pathfinder? They've played various different game systems that I was testing, but they'd never really played the actual original D&D. So we're doing that.
And, I think that we're going to get into a little bit here, but so. First of all, and I'm going to go ahead and spice myself here in the chat. Pathfinder is a superior system, so it's fine that they didn't try D&D yet.
Listen,
However, bringing this back to cozy fantasy,
yes, please.
I just said that so we can clip it later.
I know.
We think about like cozy fantasy, right? And what these nice adventures are is like, okay, so you got your module. That's what they call them in D&D, right? Module.
Mhm.
And I've always viewed the modules as like, guidelines. The quote from Pirates of the Caribbean. The thing about the code is it's kind of more like guidelines. The thing about the AP, the thing about the module is it's more like guidelines. And so for me, I really love them because you can run they write your plot and then you get to create the rest, the cozy part of it, right? So I don't have to worry about balancing out an encounter. I don't have to worry about the math of it. The book did the math problem.
You just get to
I
focus
get
on this
the
story
characters.
stuff, the characters, the fun.
Yes.
And that's, again, where the focus should be, I think.
Right.
And yeah, that we talk about these systems as if they're very important, but no one really, like, no one's playing an RPG going, "Oh, you remember when I rolled a 20?" No, you're remembering when you had a good time with your friends, you did something cool, or
Hmm.
you mined through a wall and ended up in a halfling sex dungeon. It was never about it's never about the defeating the bad guy. It's about the friends we made along the way.
It really is though, and so like I think that I can definitely tell like a little bit of a story, but in our oldest campaign, which has been running for 7 years,
Jesus Christ.
I had a character ascend to godhood at this point, right? But like in our oldest campaign, we're getting like it's our evil campaign, so we are the bad guys. But the things we get so caught up sometimes and I mean I'm talking 3 to 4 hours of just planning. Or like, oh
Mm.
no, right? And this isn't cozy per se, but like it's the back and forth between the characters. And again, the stakes are high because we're at level like 18 at this point. So we're basically godchildren. But like there was a point where I finally had to acknowledge as my character like that I was gonna PvP another character. And it took us 3 hours of back and forth in character to get there. But I was like, listen, if you make this choice,
I'm gonna
we're
hit
gonna
you.
fight about it, and you have 84 HP and I have 300. Good luck with your spells. I'm gonna just beat you to death.
Gonna beat you
but
to death with your own face.
but okay, so like bringing it back, it wasn't the battle that is memorable. The battle was very short. It was the 3 hours of back and forth trying to understand how we get from a point A to a point B that made that session so pivotal. And while yeah, it was kind of it's a little crazy. Like it allowed us to have that space.
Mhm.
Um, because we've done the shopping episodes, to be honest.
That's it.
We literally just did a shopping episode actually like a couple of months ago where my character, because I'm playing, so my first character ascended to godhood because Cthulhu killed the god that my character replaced, the trickster god of the universe.
Of course.
You know.
That's
Anyways,
one
I'm
does.
not the GM, so whatever your opinion on the plot is, take it to them, not me. I'm just
I
a player
will.
character.
I assure you, I will.
Uh, Keep that thought inside my brain. Anyways, and so, but now I play her first disciple, which was a character that had been drawn from the deck of many things, which was like a knight, right? So for my character, when we're getting to like the reason why they're so passionate enough to literally kill another party member is because like the island we were defending, like that island is where his god's only temple is.
Hmm.
Right? And so it wasn't that his motivations were I want to kill everybody or anything like that. No, no. See, the island where his god's only shrine is on that island. And if the opposing force is allowed to prismatic cannon this island, no, no, no.
Can
He's
happen.
killing everybody first.
Yep, because the stakes are personal, which
A
is
person.
what makes cozy fantasy work.
Exactly.
Okay, I have a thesis statement.
Oh, hit me.
Okay, so fantasy is a conservative, large C genre. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's all about grandiose military battles and heroics and making sure the right bloodlines on the throne, all this stuff. Yeah,
Hmm.
cozy fantasy is small c conservative. It's about upholding the actual traditions that matter. It's about, well, we talk about it being pastoral, that this idea of people just running their own little farm, or running their own little business in the case of a certain coffee shop that should not be mentioned. It's all very, it's that small focus on family and friends and community, which is so different from what you see in the epic scale.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that, especially when we think about the focus on like family and friends. Like you find in cozy fantasy as a subgenre that we end up getting to actually see like what happens after like a bad thing happens or like characters go through things versus when you're in big C genre
Hmm.
fantasy, characters have a fight, the main character realizes they were wrong, the other character dies.
Yes.
And
And
that happens a lot.
then they just proceed as normal, having no feelings about it whatsoever.
Pretty much. Whereas in cozy fantasy, like we get to see that like the antagonists don't always die and the people who make bad choices don't always die, and then we have to actually work through the consequences of those choices.
That's it. Well, in terms of writing advice, one of the best pieces I ever heard was don't kill your characters, because the minute you kill a character, any possible influence they have over the plot is gone. Any possible future storylines involving them are gone. It's so much more interesting, particularly in the case of someone who's been defeated, who's evil or done the wrong things, to keep them hanging around and having to deal with the consequences of what they've done.
Yeah. And when we think about the fantasy bones and the ways that that can be interesting, we talk about the hobbits going back to the Shire. Well, who did they run into on their way back to the Shire? I don't remember his name, so I'm relying on you.
I don't know. Who
This,
do we run into?
it's the worm guy. There's the word worm is in his name.
Wormtongue.
He's yeah, Sauron's little guy.
Yeah, Saruman's little guy. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
his
whatever.
funny little guy. Yeah,
Yeah.
and Saruman as well was in the
Mhm.
Shire. That he was Sharky
Mhm.
because everything had to be some stupid fucking name for hobbits. We can't pronounce Saruman. You're gonna have to be Sharky. You're sorry.
Right. So, but like when we think about like those characters could have easily died, and we get moments which are more like okay. So when we think about the movies, which are significantly less cozy than the books,
100%. Yeah,
right?
there's
All of
very
that is
little
not there.
coziness in it.
Yeah, that all of that is not there because it's easier. I think it's cheaper. Is what I'm going to say
Mm,
to kill them in the moment for the
mm,
shock value.
absolutely, but
And
this was something we're talking about in terms of Game of Thrones versus Frieren.
yeah, right. When we think about especially the shock value of things and like the need for plot twists in every show, and everything has to
Hmm.
be grim dark. It's like, well, no wonder we want these beautifully made shows. With like colorful background focused on cleaning a statue or growing some flowers that have
Hmm.
presumably been extinct. It's like because everything around us can be this grim dark in our daily lives, and to be honest,
Absolutely,
sometimes I just want to grow some flowers.
100%. And I think, yeah, we talk about the world that we live in being quite a depressing place. Like we talk about late stage capitalism and all the rest of it. But I think a bigger influence on the average person's day to day life is the media they're consuming.
Yeah.
And I don't mean this in the sense of, if you're sitting there reading happy books all the time, you're going to be happy. But we as a species, as little monkeys, we are not meant to have knowledge of what's happening all around the world. Like our brains can only hold maybe 100 odd people before we start getting confused and upset and all the rest of it. So the fact that we know about all these atrocities happening everywhere around us, our can't cope with that. It just seems like this is something horrible and personal that's happening to us, as opposed to something distant and completely disconnected from our day to day lives. And it's interesting to see that reflected in the fiction as well, because you're saying cozy fantasy is a response to that. Cozy fantasy is a response to the grim, dark nature of reality. And I'm wondering if we took the news off TV, if we took people away from their internet connection that tells them all the horrible shit that's happening all around the world all the time, how much of cozy fantasy would have survived that?
And so when we think about right, and so the way that I think about that is I think about what books were popular post 2008 when the American financial crash happened. YA fantasy had a huge push in that time.
Hmm.
Post 2008 is when you get the Hunger Games. That's when
Hmm.
you get, a lot of these really like cornerstone books, right? For YA fantasy and cementing it as a genre to be taken seriously. And those
Absolutely.
were times of further, I would say, economic prosperity in the decade that passed through there, right? And so we
Hmm.
find that the stories are more driven towards the almost like the invention of a war to keep us like kind of engaged because our
Yeah.
lives had become less focused on the grim dark, the like you said, like the almost overswallowing of news. But I think now with where we are in technology, there's not really a way for us to get back to that sort of space because
Yeah.
so much of everything is 24/7, 365, you know?
Absolutely. There's no
And
escape.
so we have to escape somewhere. And I think that's why I think cozy fantasy as a subgenre is working really well and it's really popular right now. And you find these shows with that have been around for a long time. Like you said, Delicious in Dungeon is has been around for a while as a light novel, right?
Hmm.
Shoot, you
Manga, I
told
think
me
it was. Yeah.
manga, right? My bad. But you told me to read it 2 years ago,
Yeah, at
and
least.
yeah, right. And like now I'm getting to watch the anime, and I'm like, I gotta pick this up. This is so good, But
They've done such a good job with the anime, though. Like, it's even the reason I pushed for the manga over the anime was because I didn't think the anime was going to do it justice, and it absolutely has. It really, like, every goofy facial expression Marcel pulls has been transferred across on the screen. It's just
and like so I think when you bring up Marcel, I think we've also got like a really good example of like the ways that cozy fantasy forces these smaller moments, right? So Marcel and Senshi are meant to hate each other. They
they
are.
should.
They should hate each other, but they don't. Right? They have these really poignant moments between the two of them, especially like in the scene pretty recently. I think it was an episode or two ago, and this is a spoiler alert because this is recently out. Anyways, but Marcel washes Senshi's hair to make it
Yeah,
so that Senshi can walk across the water, and Senshi has to accept in that moment, like, okay, well maybe magic isn't the worst, right?
yeah.
Still doesn't like magic, but their circumstances have forced them to have to work together to overcome differences.
And to
And
acknowledge the strength in each other as opposed to just continuing to butt heads. Yeah,
yeah, and I think it's what makes it so effective is that like it would be easy for capital C fantasy to kill one or the other of the two of them.
absolutely.
As shock value, as so the character that survives that can have survivor guilt and feel so bad about the way that they treated each other, whereas having them continue to adventure together is so much more engaging. It brings us so much more.
Now, one of the reasons I think that Delicious in Dungeon and your D&D tabletop fantasy stuff works as cozy fantasy is because the stakes of death are removed.
Yeah,
Within Delicious in Dungeon, there's people whose job is to wander around the dungeon, find any adventurers who died, drag them back upstairs, resurrect them, charge them for it. Like there's a whole economy built around this thing, and it's much the same in D&D. Once you're over a certain level, if someone in your party dies, you just go, now we've got to go all the way back to the priest and pay them and get it fixed. It's not oh my god, my beloved friend has passed away. This is going to be a chore.
yeah, pretty much. Like the only character death we have that's actually genuinely remained constant is the chosen character death in our big campaign, which is that my character ascended to godhood. That's it.
Yeah,
Everybody
because
else has come back to life twice.
and I again, I've never been a proponent of bringing people back from the dead in RPGs. I've always tried to make it so that people wouldn't do that shit because I prefer for there to actually be stakes in stories. But at the same time, it's kind of lovely to have a story where it's like, oh no, the bad guy killed her friend. He'll be back next week.
Yeah, or like so the whole hook of Delicious in Dungeon in the anime as it starts is that Fallen is inside of the dragon,
Yes, a giant dragon has eaten one of their party members,
and you're
and
like,
they
wait,
have to go and get.
they're gonna spend months doing this? This is gonna take time? What? And it's really effective because you just have to accept that as the meta of the universe as
Yeah,
it continues
you
to
go.
explain itself.
Exactly, and you do just kind of shrug and be like, okay, I guess we're just trying to save her before she's digested. That's fine.
Yeah. Which is actually really appropriate for the concept of the show. It's all about
Absolutely is.
digestion and nutrition. But something you had said about the removal of death and the ecosystem of bringing you back to life reminded me a lot of Stardew Valley. and how like exhaustion works as a mechanic there, and that like I mean the monsters aren't gonna kill you if the monsters get you, but you're gonna have to pay.
Yep. And it's going to be a nuisance and an impediment, and you can work out ways around that if you set yourself up correctly. Like you make sure you're not carrying anything too expensive when you're going in places where there's lots of monsters. So if you do lose it, it's not the end of the world. But it is still just built into it. It is almost the video games aspect of it, where the if I die, it's okay. I'll just start over.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's a neat thing to see in other genres outside of gaming. It's cool to find stuff. Well, I mean, you know me, I'm a lit RPG guy. I come from that background of taking game stuff and putting it into story. And some of the most fun I've had is when you take something that we consider completely normal in a game and you plop it into a fantasy story, and suddenly it's game breakingly powerful.
Yeah.
Like my Savage Dominion series that I did with Luke Shmalenko, the main characters, they're just people, really. They're just dottering through, but they have this special ability that if they die, they respawn.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone else in the world just dies. They respawn though, and so of course they're suddenly much more powerful than everyone else. They can throw themselves into situations that no one else would dare to because they can just come back again. And you see that across a few different anime and things as well, where they bring that back. I think a good one was Log Horizon, which is one of these we're trapped in the video game sort of stories.
Mm-hmm.
And it soon comes past that they realize, okay, all the characters when they die, like the player characters that are trapped in it, if they die, they come back again. All the non-player characters, if they die, they stay dead. So suddenly you've got this two-tier system where, because they're all characters in the game now, the immortal ones are throwing themselves in the way to stop their favorite farmer from dying. And that seems silly, but because of course one is a computer generated character and one's a person. But the same shit happened to me. I remember playing Skyrim, and at one point vampires attacked a city and they killed my favorite blacksmith, and I was heartbroken. It's like, now who the hell am I going to sell all this leather straps to? This is that
Right.
was my guy.
That was my guy. And it allowed you to like the way the game essentially is paced is that it allowed you to grow a genuine relationship. There was I'm assuming you probably really liked him also, knowing you, because he's got some good dialogue bits.
Yeah,
He's
that's
interesting to talk to, you know?
that. Yeah. Yes, Fane, I know lots of people who would have bought leather straps from me. That's neither here nor there. I was just annoyed because that was my guy for selling the leather straps to. That was my leather straps guy.
Right? I know a
But
guy.
yeah, I know a guy. But no, it's Skyrim's a terrible example of this because Skyrim's it's not the characters don't have much character. They cycle through like the same 5 lines or whatever. Occasionally you'll have one that's a little plot line or whatever, but people still get really attached to them in that very cozy fantasy way. Like, yeah, that's the blacksmith, my friend, who I
Hmm.
sell my treasure I've stolen from goblins to, and shit like this.
And I think it's an innate human need again for that authenticity, for that like just to create that bond. Like it's just something that we do naturally, and I think
Yeah,
cozy fantasy takes its notes from, like you said, from romance, from cozy mystery, and really pulls that together and to put it into fantasy makes it altogether more interesting than a lot of the stuff that gets put out because it turns a lot of your conventional plot like pieces and tropes on their head to make them
absolutely.
cozy. You know,
And honestly, I'm so excited to see what happens with cozy fantasy going forward.
same.
Because I can't wait until we have the story about like the little old lady living in a village and someone dies and she has to go and investigate it, but actually she's not a little old lady, she's a 9,000-year-old lich. And I can't wait for that shit. It's gonna be so fun.
Okay. I think myself in the chat would also just like to petition. Can you just write it instead of making the rest of us wait it? Just write it. We'll buy it. We'll buy it. Sold. Sold.
Listen, I've got too many books to write. I don't have time. I'll get to it one of these days, but there's just so much potential in cozy fantasy to do so many cool and different things. And I say that knowing well that you have written a cozy fantasy book
Yes.
that does a lot of these things really cool and really well and focuses on a lot of the stuff that we really love about cozy fantasy.
And I think it's a lot of the things that also work with fantasy as well is, something that I've always believed in effective fantasy is that magic doesn't solve problems. And I think that's a lot of what you get is that like you can have your folks who come at it with the mentality of like Marcel, magic's the answer to everything, but it's much more interesting when it's not. It's
Oh,
much more
absolutely.
interesting when you have to figure out how to deal with the fact that the wagon that plows your field doesn't have the tire anymore, and you don't have anybody around you that has the ability to fix this magically. So, well, first you have to have a breakdown about it, and then you get to go explore the next town over and meet the guy who's going to help you fix this wheel.
Absolutely.
And so like while it is low stakes in that the world did not end, the world felt like it was ending to the character.
Exactly. And I love that. That is what makes an interesting story. It's the characters. It's not anything to do with how big the dragon is or how many times the universe will end if you fail in your quest. It's oh shit, my wheel's broken. How the hell am I going to get my wheel fixed?
Exactly. So it's like we don't need to Sailor Moonify everything. Like we don't need her to essentially end and remake the world for 10,000 times over while battling the force that is chaos. Like we don't need Goku or Sailor Moon. Like sometimes you just need Yamcha. To be honest, you know, your little guy.
Fuck. It's just a little guy.
Yeah. Like I don't know. I love me some little guy, some funky little guys. Just a little guy. Just funny little guy.
Well, again, Legends of Latties did that spectacularly well. There were so many little guys in it. Like you could argue almost everyone in it was just a little guy.
Yeah.
Like
But
you had the I'll fix up your building guy. You had your I'll bake your cakes guy. You had your weird wizard playing chess with himself guy. You had
you had the weird little guy, the drunkard at the tavern that sold Viv the property, which used to be a livery,
this is it. And they're all just little guys, and
Yeah.
that's because in real life, that's all you meet is a lot of weird little guys who've all got their own stuff going on.
Yeah, right? And it makes for really compelling fiction to have these characters in your stories, but you and I both know in like our big C fantasy, um,
Mm,
those characters don't survive.
absolutely not. They're cannon fodder to make you feel bad about what's happening. What one of the things like I may have mentioned this, but I am playing the new Baldur's Gate game. And one of the things that works really well in it is the depth of the game, where every single like normally you play a fantasy game, there's some goblins, yeah? No. Every single one of these guys has a name. They've got their own stuff going on. They have different relationships with the other goblins. They have religious arguments with the other goblins about who they're following. They've and it's just wild how much is in there. And if you slow down and actually stop and talk to everyone, you get that. But the game is an epic fantasy game, so you don't stop and talk to them. You fireball them, and then
Yeah.
you move on. And but it's fascinating to know that that depth is there if you were to find a way to stop and chat with them.
It makes for the game to essentially allow you to play in multiple styles, and I think that what makes it so that more people pick it up. It's a really it's a really smartly made game that way. And
Mm.
I do think that when you think about all the romance options, like I'm sorry, that's an undeniable note to Stardew Valley,
Hmm.
right? And
Absolutely. I
how
mean,
cult popular that game is, right? And I'm sure
don't,
there's
don't get me
other
wrong. Like,
games.
I was going to say, like Dragon Age and things like that, they all had your romance options and stuff as well. But
Yeah.
it's definitely they've definitely put a focus on the romance that I wasn't expecting them to do,
Hmm.
and I think it is just because of stuff like cozy fantasy, the gates are opening up a little bit wider. People who are interested in fantasy but don't necessarily want to read about a grizzled man chopping off a dragon's head with one hand, they've got options now. And I
Hmm.
think the wider the genre gets, the better the genre gets. The more
Yeah.
people are invited around the fire, the more people can share their stories, and the more every individual story will improve because of it.
Yeah, I think that cozy fantasy allows for us to explore the characters, warts and all,
Hmm.
in a way that's meaningful for each character. And like we said, actions have consequences because we take out the stake of death in it as much. You end
Yeah.
up with a lot more interesting situations. Sorry, I don't know what it is with my face today. It's like having a moment. I keep having to touch it, but here we are. Honestly,
Sorry.
I can't tell if it's my hair getting in my eyes or what, but
One of the things that I always really enjoyed coming to writing fantasy again after a break from it for reasons we don't need to get into, was I'd gone off and written some romance, and it was great coming back to writing fantasy after having done that. Where in romance you don't have action scenes, you have dialogue, and all of your action is the dialogue. So your dialogue has to be as sharp as it can possibly be. Everyone's got to be it's more about the interpersonal relationships, and I just love bringing that into fantasy and having the action and the like. I feel like the wider we expand the genre, the closer we're going to get to having the perfect book,
The perfect
like
book.
that encompasses everything. Like, because
Yeah.
just now we've got a book. You know, you get a book that does action really well, or that does the politics of it really well, or does the romance really well, and eventually we're going to have a book that does it all.
And everybody's gonna hate it.
Yeah,
It's
everyone's going to hate it equally.
it's gonna be bad. Like, because if it's everything, if it's all of the things, then it's gonna be bad.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
yeah.
I have one other book I wanted to mention that
Yeah.
isn't cozy fantasy, but it's definitely adjacent. And that's because it's the Goblin Emperor
Mm-hmm.
by, I think, Catherine Arden. I will have to double check that. The Goblin Emperor by, no, it's not Sarah Manette. She went by a different name when she published it. Come on, Catherine Addison. I apologize. Um, Absolutely adore that book. There's very little in the way of violence and murder and traditional fantasy stuff in it. It's just about an heir to the throne of this empire inherits it
Mm-hmm.
and then has to deal with all the politics and all the different factions that are all arguing. And it's a very dense book. It's not the easiest to read, but it's 100% worth it because it just pays off beautifully. Where you have all these character focus moments where you just get to see him almost shaping the world around what his beliefs are
Mm-hmm.
eventually, once he works out what the hell he's doing. And that, I don't think that led to cozy fantasy, but it definitely hit a lot of the same notes as cozy fantasy while still being on that huge epic scale. So yeah, 10 out of 10 to them. Good job.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit about N.K. Jemison's debut, which was not Broken Earth, it was the Inheritance trilogy, right?
Mm.
And a lot of what happens there, the setup there is like it's very dense, but it's like a lot of governing, and that's high fantasy. Make no mistake, anything by NK is high
Oh,
fantasy. But
absolutely.
like a lot of what was driven about it is that like there's this politics and all of this in this very densely populated world with these different countries and things, but there's also
Mm.
the romance aspect to it that I think keeps you going because those books are very much romantasy as it should be,
Mm.
in my opinion, especially the second one. So like if we want to point to a really good version of romantasy, not to name names, but the
Are you
Inheritance
ever going to let it
trilogy.
go? Just leave Fourth Wing alone. It's doing its own thing over there.
I didn't say it. There's plenty of
You're
other there's
thinking it loud enough that we could hear you.
There's plenty of other romantasies that are bad, just for the record.
That's true.
I've read
There's
plenty
plenty
of
of.
them. My
I was waiting to
undergrad,
say,
yeah, my undergrad professor once said to me, "We've got to get you away from these romance fantasies," and I was like, "Why?" And I
this
still
is where
hold
I
to that.
live.
Why? I enjoy this.
Oh dear.
So, but
Right.
I think we've pretty much run out of the course. Was there anything else you wanted to mention?
There was probably a few things I wanted to mention, but it's all escaping my mind now, and I'm just realizing how late it's gotten. So, next week, it's the first Sunday of the month. We are going to be playing Pathfinder, I believe.
Yes. Yep. Next week's episode will be Spooktown Weenies, which is a run of the Season of Ghosts, the Pathfinder Second Edition adventure path. I will be your game runner, and hopefully we will not be starting an hour late because we are going to work out all of those kinks ahead of time.
Fingers crossed. And
Yeah, we'll
I'll
see.
be a Ratman. Job,
Yes.
Ratman, name Ratman.
Right. Exactly.
Can't wait.
So
UK time, that will be 8 p.m. Fane. So it is 3 p.m. US time?
EST. Yep. 3
Yes.
p.m. EST, 8 p.m. UK time.
Yes.
So we will
And
be
it's gonna happen.
joined by our crop of other silly little guys who'll be
Yes.
joining us. So, well,
Yes, thank you everyone that tuned
thank you
in
for
to hear
joining.
us blither about fantasy.
Cozy fantasy.
Cozy fantasy, in fact. I'm not sure if we hit the nail on the head with it, but I think we definitely have spoken quite a lot about cozy fantasy for an hour.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's fine. Sometimes you have a hammer fist. It's good. The nail ends up in there in the end.
Yeah, we'll get there eventually.
So, all
Right. So,
right.
thank you, everyone,
Thank you,
and
everybody. Please
bye bye.
follow, like, subscribe,
Yes.
find us here. You can also find us on YouTube. And my, yeah, definitely different genre.
Yeah.
So, but you can find us here. We will be on TikTok shortly as soon as I get my shit together. And so you can find us on YouTube, find us here, and find us there.
Yes.
Thank you for tuning
And
in,
also,
everybody.
you can buy my books if you want more
Yes, you
of my
can.
thoughts.
Yes. So absolutely, pick up Gray's books. They're amazing. Pick up
Thank you.
anything by G.D. Penman. You'll enjoy it. I just finished Dungeons of Strata. If you'd like to have a bone to pick with our dear friend here, read
I
those books.
I love when people read them and then immediately send me a message to say, "Oh, fuck you," particularly.
Yeah. So,
Good times.
but thank you as always, everybody, and we will see you guys next week.
Yes, thank you. Bye bye.
Bye, everyone.